What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Hi, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. And I'd like to ask you from the outset, if you like the podcast, please like it on iTunes because that helps us become more popular and spread the word. And today, my guest is Stephen Earle, who's been a student of Japanese language and East Asian culture and history for almost 50 years, having lived in Japan for nearly 20 years. And Steve has also been an international businessman for at least that long, having crossed the Pacific Ocean by his estimate more than 250 times. Part of catching the Japan bug early in life for Steve was his fascination with the spiritual aspects of Japanese culture, such as aikido, the Japanese healing arts, and what I'll call the Japanese New Thought movement. He's written or translated 3 books about Japanese spiritual teachers, including Words, Characters, and Transparency, and his most recent book, Heaven's Win, The Life and Teachings of Nakamuru Tempu. Steve is also the co-translator of a book about the founder of Aikido. I've invited Steve to be my guest on the show to talk about his early experience with Japanese culture, the teachers he encountered there, and his reflections on the nature of the meta relationship between Japan and the United States. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Steve, you've had a lifelong love affair with the East, particularly Japan. What are your earliest memories of this attraction?
Well, the earliest memory that I have is from when I was about 9 years old. And my brother and I were alone in the house looking for something to do. And we decided we'd go looking for treasure. And I discovered that I'd grown just tall enough to get up to the top drawer of this high chest that my parents had in one of the rooms. And we'd never been there before. We had no idea what was in the drawers. So, I got up there and, began going through the drawers. And the first thing that I found, were these 2, Malaysian, short swords. They're called kris. One of them had the sort of wavy snake-like blade. And another one had sort of a mahogany handle. But anyway, for kids, really cool stuff, and it was obvious that they were there to be out of our reach, and we found them. But the thing that really captured my attention was in the same drawer. There was a piece of cloth of some kind that was wrapped in a piece of newspaper, and the newspaper was in Chinese, or what we thought was Chinese. And this was fascinating. And I remember distinctly taking this down and finding a spot of sunlight coming in through the windows on the floor and looking at this piece of newspaper. And there were all of these little characters printed on the newspaper. And we sort of went down the characters. I mean, I was old enough to read, and I knew A, B, C's, and D's. But this was nothing like it. And we'd sort of hone in on a character and then see whether we could find it again. And some of them would be recurring. Some of them, yes, we could find the same character again. Some others we couldn't. And the other really interesting thing is that we could clearly distinguish that there were 3 different kinds of character being used. The first were these sort of typical Chinese ideographs. I mean, very complex characters made up of all these lines pointing off in different directions. And the second was also very linear, but much more simple. There were straight lines, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 lines in some sort of combination. And the third was cursive. They were curved shapes. And of course, it was many, many years later after I got to Japan and remembered, thought back on this experience, that I realized that what we weren't looking at, what we were looking at, was not Chinese but Japanese, and that this was the kanji, the katakana, and hiragana of Japanese. But the other thing that the strong impression that it made on me was that there was, it wasn't just the newspaper and the characters. It was the idea that there was a whole culture behind this, and that there were people that were reading. And in my young mind, it sort of boggled me. It seemed so much more sophisticated than the ABCDs that I was reading. And I had this image of children my age going to school, learning to read this stuff, and I really felt that I'd been one-upped, that I was at a disadvantage somehow.
I mean, I just think it's amazing that at 9 years old you could distinguish between those. Yes, it wasn't Chinese, it was Japanese, but still you could distinguish between the 3 different types of writing.
Yes.
So obviously, on some level, maybe speaking to your unconscious, that led you on the path to get you to move to Japan. Could you?
Well, possibly. Possibly. I mean, all this stuff went back in the back drawer, and I really didn't think about it again until after I got to Japan. I'm a child of or I lived through the 60s, as I know that you did. And it was a complicated time. I did a lot of things that we were doing back in those days, the long hair and the drugs and all that sort of thing. And out of the path out of that was something called macrobiotics, which is a philosophy, a practical philosophy of health and well-being that came out of Japan. It was first espoused by a guy named George Osawa, and there was a very influential and charismatic teacher of macrobiotics named Michio Kushi, who was in Boston, and I happened to attend one of his lectures in Boston one day. And got hooked and fell into the whole thing. I joined one of his study houses and began eating brown rice, cut my hair off short, began wearing proper clothes and all that kind of thing. And it was after a couple of years of that, and also while practicing macrobiotics, I began practicing aikido. Which is a Japanese martial art, and various other things. And the idea, somewhere along the line, I got the idea in my head that I'd like to go to Japan. It seemed like a good thing to do at the time. I thought to myself that I'd go there for about a year, study some things about Oriental medicine and natural agriculture and Aikido, and then I'd come home. I was 22 years old at the time, so those sort of decisions are fairly easy at that time. Plus, going from the United States to Japan was a much less expensive proposition than it is now, because the value of the yen was it was really like going to in terms of monetary differences, like going to a third world country. So it was quite easy to get there financially.
Yeah, I mean that was a natural pathway in a certain sense back in those days. If you were involved in macrobiotics, as both of us were, certain people, it's like you studied in a study house. You encountered Michio, and you said, "Wow, maybe I should go to the Heartland."
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Well, we're making short of it, but you were there for like almost 20 years, I believe.
Yeah, it was 16 years proper. I got there in the fall of 72, and I came home in the summer, late summer of 88. But it was all of my, or most of my 20s and my 30s were spent living in Japan.
So what I'm trying to visualize, you're a young pup. You're probably 6'1". I remember you being tall, and you were decidedly a racial minority living in an Asian nation. And I'm wondering what that whole experience was like for you, and what did it teach you about yourself as an American? Big question.
Yes, well, it is. But lots of different ways to get at it. But one of the first things I think is that America and Japan are such natural polar opposites in so many different ways. I mean, we have the westest of the west and the eastest of the east, with this big ocean in between. When you say you're Japanese, it's not just a racial distinction, although it is a racial distinction. It's also a cultural distinction. It means more or less that your ancestors have lived on this set of islands for the last, who knows, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 years. And of course, when you say you're an American, it means something entirely different. There are Americans who don't even speak English very well. That's not, race and where you come from and so forth is not a criteria for being an American. And one of the things that you run into very often in Japan, everybody runs into it, is you get asked by Japanese, what do Americans think about this? Or what do Americans do in such and such a situation? And where they're coming from is that on the Japanese side, there is there is such thing as a standard for what it is to be Japanese. There is a standard answer to all of those questions. But of course, in America, there isn't. You have, you have all kinds of extremes, and you have you have the in between. I have to say that I found it, it was absolutely exciting. I mean, it was exciting from the beginning to the end of the 16 years that I was living in Japan. I used to think when I got up in the morning, no matter what the problems of the day or whatever were, I'd think to myself, yeah, but I'm living here. I'm living in this. I'm living in Japan, and you'd step outside of yourself, and every day there would be something new that would hit you in the face, that would challenge your way of thinking about how you thought about the world. That there were people thinking about the world in an entirely different way.
So I'm wondering, after 16 years, did you come up with like a kind of an elevator answer to the question is, what is it like to be an American, or what is America like?
No, I can't say that I have, because again, I think that that there's so many different Americans and so many different kinds of Americans, and everybody's going to have a different answer to what it's like to be an American. And that, and in saying that, that might be the elevated
Right.
answer. I mean, it's one of the great things about this country, is that we are this vessel that's able to hold all of these different cultural, cultural and ideological and all these different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, my brief experience in Japan, in comparison to yours, was like people would have the stereotype of America being New York City.
Yes.
And something
New
like
York City,
yeah.
New York City or California.
Right.
Yep.
And from a perspective of an island nation, it's kind of a reasonable question, to your point. So I know that you studied with or studied about a variety of teachers of what I'll call the Japanese cultural and spiritual arts, and I'd like to talk to you about some of the major ones that influence you. And I think probably a good place to start is your study of aikido. You started practicing probably in Boston, and you've kept up the study. What was it like studying it in Japan? And what were your teachers like?
Well, it was a wonderful experience, and it's something that I continue to this day. And I have, I've continued to go back and forth to Japan. So, and I lived again in Japan for a year in 2004, and trained in Aikido again during that time. So I have lots of associations with lots of people, and have trained under a number of different teachers there. I don't mean to make myself out to be being a superior martial artist, because I'm far from that. But it's something that I thoroughly enjoyed and have invested a lot of time in.
Did you have a particular teacher that had a strong influence on you there?
Well, the one that had the strongest influence, and I say that not because my Aikido looks like anything like his, but because he was a strong influence, was a teacher named Yamaguchi Seigo Sensei. And his older brother was Yamaguchi Alkan Sensei, who was a macrobiotic teacher. And I actually met my wife at the older Yamaguchi's house in Kyoto, back when very early on, when I first moved to Japan. But while I was living in Osaka, Yamaguchi Seigo Sensei, his younger brother, came down to Osaka and was invited to start a dojo inside the company that I was working for. So there was a family connection, there was a company connection, there was a very sort of in crowd. And what I remember best is Yamaguchi Sensei coming down from Tokyo with about 5 of his senior students to the opening ceremony that they held for this dojo, which is it was in this tiny space on the top floor where I worked, and where there was also a macrobiotic learning center. And he held a demonstration. And I won't attempt to describe it, but what I'll say is that it took what I thought Aikido to be to a different level. I thought of it in terms of sort of a physical art, as a good way to get good exercise and and contact with other human beings, and lots of really good things about it. But what I saw him demonstrating was something completely different. He was doing things that just didn't make any sense. And I said, wow. And a couple of things came out of that. At first I said, wow, I really want to pursue that. And also at the same time, there was something really, really humbling about it. It said that this is, really, really deep, really, really profound. Chances are that I'm never, ever going to be close to this guy's ability. And in realizing that, there's a sort of weight that goes off your shoulders. That's not what it's about. What you're then allowed to do is just go and to train and to thoroughly enjoy it. And so that's really been my approach to Aikido ever since.
Well, one of the things that you and I share is a fascination between the relationship between sound, language, and reality. And in fact, that's kind of how you and I first came in contact with, through the work of a woman, hopefully I don't mispronounce it, Madame Sanae Odano, or Odano Sensei. In fact, I'll just briefly tell the story. I was taking a spiritual seminar, was what it was called, from Misho Kushi, and Odano Sensei was there, and she was almost like she was like having an in-joke with her translator, and really wasn't paying too much attention with us. And so it seems to me that Misho, to get her to demonstrate her unique ability, he had us give her a word, an English word, and she didn't speak any English. And she broke it down to its root syllables in a way that I'll never forget. It was something like tyranny, and she went ti, ra, ni. Each of those syllables meant something. And that just fascinated me. And I ended up reading an article about her, or by her, in the Order of the Universe magazine at the time, and asked Misho for her address, and which I wrote. That was back before the days of the internet. And you responded to me with a letter, and something to the effect that her teaching is even difficult for even some Japanese. I still remember that letter. But anyway, you were kind of her liaison, if it will, between I'll call it the Western world and Japan. And in fact, you wrote a book about her, which I alluded to. I wonder if you could briefly tell me a little bit about Odano Sensei and what what motivated you to study with her.
Yes, well, she is certainly the single most influential person in my life. I met her in 1977 for the first time, and I really quickly developed into a student-teacher relationship in the true sense of the word, and the true sort of the way that it's understood in the Oriental traditions. And I continued even after leaving Japan in '88. I was traveling back and forth to Japan frequently, and would always call on her. The last time I saw her was just a week or 10 days before she died, which is in 2001. In any event, she was she was one of a kind. There's nobody like her. There will be nobody like her. She was this little woman. She just turned 70 years old when I met her in '77. So she was older then than I am today. I'm 67 going on 68. She was born in the last years of the Meiji era in 1908. Had lived through, of course, everything in between, the Second World War and so forth and so on. And she had done it as a single woman. She had just a voracious curiosity. That was probably her biggest outstanding trait. To the extent that early on in her sort of her high school years, she decided that sleep was a waste of time. There are only 24 hours in the day. You just didn't want to spend it sleeping. So she actually disciplined herself to sleep as little as possible. She also figured out that she could skip breakfast by sort of being late to come down to breakfast and then not have time. And she would always leave her lunchbox at home. So she was eating one meal a day. She got her sleeping routine down to 2 hours a night. And she would schedule her day. She had these, she was schedule her day from for the other 22 hours, exactly what she wanted to do and what she wanted to study. So anyway, that was her, those were her formative years. And after her father died, when she was 40, sitting in front of her, his casket on a cold, dark, January night, there were no lights on, she had this sudden, profound spiritual experience. And she was not a spiritual speaker. She hadn't, in all this, this curiosity, she hadn't pursued spiritual disciplines. She was much more interested in mathematics and things scientific and literature and those sorts of things. So out of nowhere, she was cast into this place that she calls second reality, which was just sort of unbounded light. There was light. And that was all there is. There were all these. Sort of like space was filled with this mist, and each bead of mist was radiating light, so that there were no there were no shadows there to be seen. And this state went on for some 4 to 5 hours before she came out of it. The thing is that she didn't come out of it saying, "Oh, now I understand. Now I'm enlightened." Nothing like that. She came out of it saying, "What the hell was that all about?" And the rest of her life was really dedicated to that. And one of the early realizations that she had very on, and this comes through the Japanese language. I won't go into it because it takes a little bit of explanation. But what she saw very clearly was this light, this formative light that was at the root of everything, this energy that was at the root of energy, was exactly the same energy that was behind human language. And the ability to think and talk and communicate in words, and so that was really the impetus behind her inquiry into language and what it was all about.
Well, I know this is a difficult subject. The closest Westerner that I know that has come close is amateur linguist named Benjamin Lee Whorf. But yes. I wonder, what could you tell us that maybe a layperson might understand about what you've come to learn about the relationship between sound language and reality?
Well, the first thing you have to look at is just how fundamental language is to being human. It's really an extraordinary thing, and it's so close to us. And the reason it's difficult to see is because it's so close to us. It's sort of like the fish swimming in water. What is water to a fish? It's like us walking around in air. We're not conscious of the air. It's so fundamental to us. But language is not just a means of communication. We spend morning, noon, and night thinking, talking to ourselves. I mean, we all do it. And it's quite interesting when you think about it, that if you're a native English speaker, like both of us are, more than likely you do most of your talking to yourself in English. So whose thoughts are they? You're speaking in a shared, you're thinking in a shared, cultural medium. The language itself, isn't self-created. So where does this all come from? The really interesting thing about it is when you, even in thinking about this, I mean, even in inquiring into what is language, the only thing you have to do is to work with is language itself. It's really, really hard to get any sort of perspective on this because you're working with the very thing that you're trying to look at.
Well, I wonder if you could maybe. This is difficult, but can you give us an idea of the thing that fascinated me with like a root meaning of a particular word, perhaps in English, and how it might be sort of dissected in the Kodatama sense? To give somebody some example of what we're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. So the thing about first of all, this phenomenon of language, of words that we're talking about, is fundamentally phonetic. It's all occurring in sound. And this, again, it's really quite astounding. You and I are carrying on this conversation. And when this goes up on your website, hopefully there'll be somebody listening to it. The people that will be listening to it will be hearing the same sounds, the same words, but they won't be hearing the sound. They won't be hearing the sounds. They'll be hearing the meanings that are coming through the sounds. I mean, we're carrying on this conversation. We're creating a whole space between us of shared understanding, shared meaning, and all of this is coming through the vehicle of sound. How the hell is this happening? And ultimately, it's never, as I was saying before, all we have to do is language to work with. So it's always going to be a mystery. It's one of those questions that you can never answer absolutely for all time. All you could do is look at it and say, "Oh, I see. Oh, I see." It reveals itself, and it reveals itself, and it reveals itself. The Japanese language has a very particular phonetic makeup. First of all, it is a vowel-based language, and probably people will think, well, every language has vowels, and they do. That's a universal. Vowels are fundamental to these sounds that we use in speech. But the difference in Japanese is that the vowels are more central, or listened to. I could explain it this way. The 5 vowel sounds in Japanese, a, I, u, e, o, are all vowel sounds in just about every other language on the planet. One of the differences in Japanese is that each of those is also a word in and of itself. So the sounds, the syllables, are word sounds. There are a whole slew of ideographic characters that can be attributed to the sound a, to the sound I, to the sound u, to the sound A to the sound O. So they carry with them meanings. And what Odano Sensei did, she again, as you said, she didn't speak English, was not particularly interested in learning English, although she did later on discover the Roman alphabet, and what a phenomenal and really, really fascinating thing that is. That's sort of a whole nother discussion. But what she did was she looked at these word sounds, and she looked at the meanings that came along with them, that came along with them culturally. That is through these ideographs, through the characters they're used to write them. And she sort of filtered through and found you could say the words that she used was the most positive. In other words, they didn't have any baggage attached to them. They were the most transparent. And she sort of cleaned this all up and composed this chart of the basic 50 Japanese word sounds with the ideographs that she thought best represented their true meanings. And so, in this demonstration that in what that you saw in Boston, that's exactly what she was doing. She was transliterating the words that she was hearing, probably for the first time in English, into Japanese katakana, that is, into the Japanese word sounds, into the syllables in Japanese, and then then explaining them in terms of the meanings that she saw that went along with it. The other point, and I don't need to go too long here, but the other point to be made about this is that, and this is really the biggest contribution of her work, is that she saw the role of written language to be just as huge as the phonetic dimension. Obviously, it came later in cultural development, but the idea that you can take these abstract concepts that we apply phonetic values to, and then to write them down and give them an actual sort of formal substance, existing in not just in time, the way that sound does, but also in space. It's really quite
yeah.
amazing.
I want to just ask you just about a small subset of what has been a lifelong study for you. As you know, when you were talking about some of these basic sounds that underlie all language, there are words that seem to be common to a lot of them, like ma, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or o, or something like
Yep.
that.
Mm-hmm.
What would Odano Sensei say about that phenomena?
Well, what she would say is that these sounds go all the way back. They go back to, in her sort of cosmology, they go back to what she arrived at at a concept of the formation of the universe, coming out of a big bang, coming out of a singularity, before the term Big Bang had, was ever introduced. She came at it, completely on her own, not from the idea of physics, but she just thought to herself, where did this all come from? It had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere that she came up was nothing. It had to come from nothing. And the only way that could happen is if nothing turned in on itself and developed this enormous friction. I'm making short of this. I'm making light of this. But out of this comes the exact opposite. The exact opposite of nothing is something. And that's the everything. And the basis of this is this energy that moves at infinite speed, which means that it's absolutely transparent. It's always right here, right now, but it's always gone at the same time, so that it can't be seen. And these sounds go back to that. And this is what we as human beings are endowed with. So the fact that these sounds should carry commonalities of meaning among different cultures and different peoples makes entire sense. All the differences in language and culture, the differences between people, the sameness is much more profound than the differences. The idea that people, there are all these cultures that have grown up and that have emerged in different parts of the world and speak different languages, but they're all using language. That's the thing that's really, really fascinating. That's the commonality. So where's that coming?
That's above my pay grade, but it's a fascinating study. And as you mentioned, it's like we don't think about these things. It's hard to think about them because we're thinking about them in language. So how do we think about language? And of course, this is what Odano Sensei did, and transferred to you.
Yes. And one of the keys to that is to look at written language, because that puts it. That's how you get the perspective, because now you have just not sounds, but you have forms. You have a formal dimension to these sounds, so it's really it's interesting.
It's hard to shift gears here a little bit, but I want you to talk a little bit, Stephen, about your most recent book, which is called Heaven's Wind, in which you introduced us to the work of Nakamuru Tempu, who is a Japanese person that's largely unknown to the West. Can you tell us a little bit about Tempu and what you learned about his life? I mean, people should read the book probably, but let's start there.
Yes. Well, this book was a 15-year-long project on my part, and one that I sort of backed into. It wasn't something at the beginning that I sat down and I decided I was going to write a book about this guy. But once I got into his story, I couldn't put it down, and it's one of the stories that is just too good not to be told. And nobody else was doing it. And so I said, I'm going to have to bite the bullet and do this one myself. Nakamura Tempu was born in 1876. That's very soon after what was called the Meiji Restoration. It was the end of the feudal era, when the samurai all cut off their top knots and put their swords away, and Japan embarked upon this whole enterprise of becoming a modern industrial nation. And he died in 1968, so that's a 91-year-long lifespan that encompasses some very interesting times. And he not only lived through those times, but he participated to an extraordinary degree in many of those events, beginning with the Sino-Japan War, the war between Japan and China back in 1894, Then 10 years later, in the Russo-Japan War, the war between Russia and Japan, during which he served as a spy behind enemy lines in northern Manchuria. Survived just the most amazing, hair-raising, most hair-raising set of adventures, but came out in one piece, except that he was soon diagnosed with tuberculosis and given about 6 months to live. And out of that, he set off on this journey that took him around the world. It took him first to New York, where he met a number of people and doing things in sort of spiritual disciplines and medical disciplines. And he ended up going to Columbia University and getting a degree in medicine, which at that time was somewhere between a 6-month and a 9-month course. But this was back in 1909, I believe the year was 1909, 1910, somewhere in that time frame. Then he went on to Europe. He lived in London. Something to be said for his constitution. The doctors had given him 6 months to live, but he was already way beyond that. So he didn't die in 6 months, but the tuberculosis was still there, and he was sick the whole time that he was doing this. And he met intellectuals and interesting people in London, and then on to Paris, and eventually sort of came to the end of the line and said, well, if I'm going to die, I want to do it back home. I want to go home. And so he got on a boat in Marseille, and began the 3-month journey, back to Japan. Well, along the way, they got sidetracked. They put into the port of Alexandria. They had to wait out for the Suez Canal to be cleared of an accident that had happened there. And a Filipino crewman said, let's go up and see the pyramids. So they went up to Cairo, and they got there late in the evening. They checked into an inn of some kind, and spent the night. During the night, he had another hemorrhage. He coughed up a whole bunch of blood, and was in no shape to get up and see the pyramids the next morning. So he sent the Filipino guy on his own, and mid-morning came down to have a bowl of soup in the restaurant. And the only other person in the restaurant was this dark-skinned man with a long white beard, and a couple of young Indian boys that were, one of them fanning him with a big peacock fan. Their eyes catch across the room, and the man invites him over to his table. They sit down, they exchange pleasantries. The man looks him in the face and he says, "You have a big black spot in your right lung." And Nakamura is taken back by this. He hasn't said anything. He said, "Yes, I have tuberculosis, and I'm going back to Japan to die." Guy looks at him again and he says, "No, not your time. Follow me." And that's the beginning of this whole other adventure, where he is led by this man into the foothills of the Himalayas. Turns out that he's a yogi. And this is, again, we're talking 1911, 1912, 1913. He spent almost 3 years studying with this man in the foothills of the Himalayas, a village that I actually visited in researching this book. It's in eastern Nepal. this is what I was starting to say. Is this is a time when yoga just wasn't known. I mean, it was known in certain elite circles in the West. It certainly wasn't well known in Japan. He had no idea what he was getting into. He had no idea, what yoga was all about, what this guy was going to be teaching, and so forth. But he spent most of his time sitting, meditating beside this huge waterfall. And in the course of things, he did go through a profound spiritual awakening or transformation. And sort of as a side effect of that, his tuberculosis went into remission. And so he was able to return to Japan in good health. So that's sort of the first half of his life. And his second half is almost equally as amazing. But he, it includes going into business and becoming very, very successful, and then giving up everything and going out to talk about what he called the philosophy of mind-body integration, or unification of mind and body, and developed a large following, had a huge influence on major figures in industry and politics and the arts and so forth. One of the reasons that I wanted to write this book is that he also lived through the Second World War. He was adamantly opposed to the war, which was a difficult thing to get away with in Japan at the time, but he did. And came out on the other side. And it was sort of in the post-war years that he and his teachings really, they became an idea whose time had come. And his mind-body integration philosophy is really one of the less well-known, but very, very it's one of the forces behind Japan's reconstruction, putting this country that had been, just decimated back together, and coming out of it eventually with flying colors. But you go through the list of people who were prime movers during that whole process, and an extraordinary number of them were students of Nakamuru Tempu. Extraordinary thing about his teachings is that they come out of this life, this really, really extraordinary life experience. Right. This is a guy who was walking the talk, and everybody who met him said this about it, that he was the embodiment of what he was talking about. These were just not empty words. He was just not up there talking about woulds, coulds, should be's. He was living it, and his methods are really really practical. I mean, he has they're still to this day. I mean, almost 50 years has gone by since he died. But his organization, the Tenpukai, is still going strong in Japan. There's still people, many people in Japan who practice his teachings.
Steve, this has been a fascinating interview, and I think I'd like to conclude it in much the way we started, by asking you a personal question. You've come a long way since the days when you discovered those Chinese writing in your parents' house, in the home that you grew up with. And you studied with a number of teachers, including Nakamuru Tempu. And I know this is a big question to ask you, Steve, but What have you come away with from all these studies, and how has it influenced the way you've lived today?
Well, I think a large part of it is just the process of growing up, which I think a lot of growing up has to do with learning to take more and more perspectives and being able to appreciate more and more perspectives on the world. And certainly living in a foreign culture teaches you, whether you like it or not, to appreciate different perspectives on the world. You really have to if you're going to continue to live in that environment. And in my case, that was not it was certainly something. It was something that I chose to do, and it was something that I did very, very willingly. And it was a wonderful, exciting experience. But the same holds true with these ideas, and many of us from that sort of magical time in our late teens and early adulthood have been looking for the truth or answers to the big questions about what is it that makes all this tick. And there are all kinds of answers out there. There are all kinds of teachers and teachings. And as you say, I've had the great privilege of studying with a number of such teachers. But what I think I've come to appreciate is that any teaching is ultimately just a conversation. That none of these ideas or sets of ideas are absolutes in and of themselves. That what we are doing, constantly doing as human beings, is engaging with the world, engaging with one another, and engaging with these ideas. And to the extent that we can give and take our understanding is not a really great word, but I'll use it for the time being. What we come to life with as a basic sort of understanding of the world grows. It becomes fleshed out. It becomes multidimensional, and I think that's a really great part of life. I mean, that's what it's all about. That's what living through difficult times and overcoming difficulties and handicaps and all that sort of thing, I think ultimately is all about, is becoming fuller, seeing the larger and the larger picture. We'll never see as long as we're part of this relative world and inhabiting physical bodies, we're never going to be able to see the whole picture. So I think I'll end with that. I hope that makes some sense and gives your listeners something to mull upon.
Thus concludes my interview with Stephen Earle, student of many Japanese spiritual teachers and author of the recently published book, Heaven's Whim, The Life and Teachings of Nakamuru Tempu. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did, and I hope listening to Steve gave you a new take on the intersection between spirituality and diversity. And did you know that if you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it and receive extra content about the show, you can do what listener Jim Paisner recently did by becoming a supporter of the show through Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can receive extra behind-the-scenes content and become, in effect, a sponsor of the show. To find out more, simply go to patreon.com and look for Diversity and Spirituality. Thanks so much for listening, and as always, I look forward to hearing your feedback.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diverge? How do they diverge? How do they diverge? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity?